Thanks, Fran. I don't want to eat into Joanna's time, so I've got about 7 minutes. But seriously, I'm not going to use a presentation which takes a long time. I'm just going to make a few remarks, and then perhaps there's time for some dialogue. My colleague Lolita Gerald's on the panel, although I will still be around and can pick up anything personal. I think in the tea break, I know one or two of you want to have a chat about your own case, but because they're live cases, I can't do in the open session. So that's all a reason, I think, just to make a few remarks if I can. The first is to say that when we talk publicly about parental alienation, the point is to acknowledge its existence and to build it into thinking in every high conflict case. That doesn't mean it's the total explanation, it is in some cases, but that it will usually have a part to play in every high conflict case. We did very much the same for domestic abuse, where in Cafcass in the early 2000s, we've been going since 2001, we performed pretty poorly on domestic abuse, and to the point where we sometimes unwittingly reunited people with their abusers. And we just did not have the ability to understand the long-term impact on the abused adult, let alone on children. So we've spent about 10 years working at that, and I think it'll be the same with parental alienation. So it's important to talk about it, to acknowledge alienating behaviours as a part of every high conflict case, and in each case to assess their impact on children. That's what we're trying to do. Some of you will feel we're doing that, some of you will feel we're not. And in the 125,000 cases a year we've got, we can only hope to continuously improve the number of cases we get right. Just something about abuse being real. It is real. It's real for many children, and it has a lifelong impact. And also abuse, allegations of abuse can be totally fabricated, and fabrication can also have a lifelong impact. I met recently a father and his son, the son being 22. When the son was 8, his mother alleged abuse against his father, who as a consequence was charged and convicted and served time in prison. So I was talking to them about why they were together, and the son said, well, it never happened. My mother made it up. And of course, this case had been through innumerable criminal and family hearings. So it is hard to assess whether abuse is real or fabricated, especially emotional harm, as Paul said, which is invisible by and large. But what we have to do is to try to piece together like a jigsaw the various factors that, as I think your other speakers have talked about, are prevalent, that we gave a very low attention to maybe 5 to 10 years ago. So if you do hear a child speaking in language about their other parent that is clearly not their language or a child's language, that's an obvious trigger. And I've tried to set out in the short paper that John instructed me to put together that, how we approach it. So I won't repeat that. And for the various factors we've highlighted, you could think of others. But it's a starting point of how we might go about it. For the child themselves, we're increasingly finding the truth is somewhere in the middle. That even when they are alienated to a greater or lesser extent, they are also actors themselves and have used themselves, not simplistic wishes and feelings, but complicated feelings, complicated wishes that if you ignore, you're also in danger of not meeting those children's best interests. So in other words, if you build up a defense mechanism against stress and against alienation and the various other factors, that defense mechanism is what enables you to carry on coping. And you only dismantle that for children with some confidence that you can repair that. And I think what colleagues have said about the absence of therapeutic services is really important, because there are innumerable court cases now where we might make a slightly better decision that includes factoring in alienation. But if it doesn't include the therapeutic help and support that those children need to recover, then we may be leaving them equally distressed as a result. So the more complicated and messy reality is that we're just beginning to, again, as Paul said, appreciate the significance of emotional harm in both public and private law. There is a crossover, quite clearly, and it's illustrated by the main increases in the numbers of children in care in the last 10 years have been because of emotional harm and neglect. Physical abuse and sexual abuse as a reason for coming into care have stayed roughly constant, but emotional harm and neglect have rocketed. And the difference between emotional harm in a public law case and emotional harm in a private law case tends to be the social class you come from. The care system is predominantly made up of the children of much poorer and deprived parents, but the emotional impact of what's going on there may be just as strong in a private law case, despite the overt symptoms not being perhaps so many drugs, so many obvious risk factors. So we need to try to harmonise what's happening to children within public and private law cases, and I suspect, whether it's in 10 years or 20 years, we'll have a single family court that is also a single family assessment across law types. What is significant, for example, is in the public law races ahead with legislation. On the 31st of October, Section 8 of the 2017 Children and Social Work Act is mandating courts and local authorities to, when making a permanence decision for a child, to take into account the ability in the care plan to help a child recover from abuse and neglect for the duration of their childhood. And it should stop so many placements of convenience, or so many placements partly due to insufficient carers, but where children are placed with other people, state carers, who do not have the long-term therapeutic caring abilities that every child needs. It's why the Adoption Support Fund is so oversubscribed. The significant gap in infant mental health, child mental health and adolescent mental health services is tragic, considering what children are going through. And I say that also as an adopted person who had two parents, two fathers, two mothers, and because of circumstances, I would say none of those four were able to adequately provide me with basic standards of care. So you do often end up, whether it's in a public or private law case, being caught in the middle. A lot of people involved, but no special person for you. So, and at that point, there were absolutely no therapeutic services. The tragedy is now we spend fortunes on court cases. If a fraction of that went on therapeutic support, we'd probably be a lot better off, which is why I say, with due respect to judges and lawyers, that cases may need a psychologist more than a lawyer. And of course, the best lawyers are in tandem with psychologists and practicing a lawyer-like psychology or a psychology-like law, which does recognise the issues, and that adversarial practice is not much use. So, what I would say about our own work in Cafcass is that we're trying to summarise in what we're calling a high conflict pathway, which is too much jargon for a Saturday afternoon, let alone anything else. But what it is to try to have more of a formula for consideration of what goes into a high conflict case that we have to recognise and use in our evidence bases. So the days when somebody says to us, well, I told you the nub of this case, but you took no notice, isn't true anymore. It is hard because if you're trying to focus on the child's perspective, sometimes the noise of adults is overwhelming. And the noise in alienation cases can be overwhelming. But I'll give you an example from when I was growing up with my adoptive father, who my adoptive mother was attempting to systematically alienate me from. But what I found most irritating about him was that every time he ate his dinner, he slurped. It sounds absolutely pathetic. But every time he ate, I became emotionally fired up. Now, why was that? Well, it was because of the alienation. He hadn't actually done anything at all. But if I described it, or somebody was trying to assess it, you would not recognize it because it had been displaced so many times. And I think that is what the main dilemma for us in Cafcass. We have limited professional time, as does every other professional, as do lawyers, unless you've got a lot of money. But assessing alienation is complicated. And to get it right, you have to spend more time with people, or to at least talk and have the right conversation. And often the starting point is the wrong conversation to get at the real issues in cases. But I'm going to stop there, and you may have some questions for me, because Lolita is going to do the panel, even though I'll be around.
Okay, I'll give it 5 minutes if that's all right. Questions for Mr. I'm going to take the man just in front of you, sorry, with the pink shirt, yep. Give your name and your question.
Yes, hi. I'm Tim Scott. Earlier this year, I was told by a Cafcass officer that parental alienation didn't exist, and not to mention it any further. My question is really, what is Cafcass doing about raising awareness within your own staff team about parental alienation?
We have about 2,000 social workers, the most in Western Europe. So, and some do take that view. And it's partly a training issue, and partly a mindset issue. And that's what we have to work at. And the reason we've developed a high conflict pathway, which will be the subject of a training module, is to change the way those practitioners think. And I think they come from a school that was a bit like saying, is it a syndrome or not? That it's a long-standing tradition to think of it as an anthem for a pressure group, more than a real factor in families.
Can I add something to that, which is, you may or may not know this, but Cafcass has got a full library on parental alienation. So you get a guardian or a social worker who says that to you, refer them to their own library materials, and then if you're going to be very hard about it, ask them to enumerate afterwards what exactly they've read.
Do you know how many have seen that?
Well, you tell them. Anyway, I won't get it. Miss Abraham.
I won't say too much because there are lots of questions. But as well as the library, we have an operating framework on our website and intranet, which defines our operating policy. And inside that, which if you look at our website, is parental alienation, the factors involved, and how we approach it. And each of our practitioners has to be compliant with that framework.
Do you make your library public?
Our library is an internal resource for practitioners, but I'll take that away and think about, because with e-access, there's no reason that can't. No. I mean, I think the issue is we have one librarian who's already spends a lot of time sending material to our 2,000 practitioners. For that librarian to service the public in the same way might be, but I think on the web, yeah, I'll take that away.
Okay, you're very keen. Yes, your name, please, and question.
Right, my name's Rob. I'm really grateful that you came here today. I was really grateful when you gave your interview about recognising parental alienation. And I was really pleased, like a lot of people, to see it in the framework for the first time, really. I've read Jo Wood as your librarian. She has 3 assistants. She contributes to a lot of articles. The last one was in 2013 that actually mentioned parental alienation. I was delighted. And then you gave an all-hands webinar to 1,400 of your FCAs. 32 of them watched it. That's it. You gave an all-hands webinar on emotional harm to 1,400 FCAs. 22 of them watched it. So my question is this a question of leadership, or your FCAs really not care? I'm glad we had a chat with you.
It's a good question. I think the highest webinar we've had is about 70, and the issue was indirect contact. Now that.
Let me just qualify. You said on your website was 68. I made 2 freedom of information requests. The second one identified that they published the wrong figures on their website, and I had to recount them. And that's the story of about 300 freedom of information requests that have gone in to Cafcass in the last 8 years. Quite often we see the reports and the data, but when we challenge it, we find the data being correct. So if you could just deal with the 32 and the 22, which come from your own data, after we go through it, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, I don't think the signing up for a webinar, people are busy, they do other things, but it is too low a number for a topic of great professional interest. And I think it's important for me to defend our practitioners in the sense of the pressures of work do mean that you are racing often to from one interview case, court case to another. So it's not easy to take time out, even if it seems obvious. But as the colleague who talked about being told parental alienation doesn't exist, we do, as I've said before, it will take us some years to achieve the degree of practice and understanding about emotional harm that we should. But it's important to say, in the assessment of our practice, independently of line managers, it's one of the highest in the country amongst social workers.
Okay, next question. I know you're very keen. Just 1 or 2 more now.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. James Miller. Given what you said about the need perhaps of psychologists rather than lawyers, and given what Judge Bartlett and Sir Whitman said about the need for early intervention, if a child is presenting with such extreme psychological abnormalities as expressing a wish to terminate relationship with the parents, I just wonder if Cafcass perhaps should be directing their staff to immediately look at getting a psychologist involved right at the very beginning, rather than waiting.
Well, we do see that whole area of assessment and enforcement as our core business ourselves. So we don't, apart from the resourcing of psychologists, we think the only guarantee of being able to deal with alienation properly in every case across the country is for it to be a core part of our own social work assessment. And I mean, you would find that our recommendations to enforce contact and to change residents have gone up considerably, and we probably do it more than any other organisation working in the field. But it's only sustainable if we have that as a core skill in our social workers, as well as access in extreme cases to psychologists.
Thanks very much. David Dunn. I host family need fodder meetings in North Harrow. Yep. I've also been a Mackenzie friend for about 15 years. And there's something that has always bothered me with regards to Cafcass. It's an observation, not a criticism, I hope. Children and Family Court Advisory Support Service. In the 15 years as a Mackenzie friend, representing non-resident parents, I have never once, only on one occasion, has a Cafcass officer offered advice to the non-resident parent. I'm just wondering, are you aware of that type of behaviour amongst your Cafcass officers?
Well, in our work before the first hearing in a private law case, we obviously contact the applicant, but we try in every case to contact the other parent. It's impossible to make a recommendation to court without that. And we are doing as much as we can within the time we've got to offer advice. And we're carrying out a pilot beginning in January in the north of England to see if we can safely conclude cases without a safeguarding letter and a first hearing through advisory work that will be signed off either with a parenting plan or by a withdrawal of the application and signed off by judges in box work if it's safe to do so. So we're trying to provide more advice and to divert more cases from court. But often the support resources that are just not there in the local community, and our job is mostly taken up with baseline assessments for court because of the volume of work coming in, and regrettably we can't provide half the level of support we would like to in cases.
One last question.
Phil was growing up GP. In the health service, as a result of a lot of very tragic cases, it became apparent that an awful lot of people who were in direct contact day to day with children who were suffering abuse didn't have sufficient awareness of how to detect it, or indeed that it went on. And the NHS's solution to that has been mandatory training. So every 3 years, I go and I get updated on child protection issues. Every 3 years I go back, it's something different, I learn something new, it raises my awareness. I'm really grateful that you've come. I'm really grateful that you've been honest and accepted that your practitioners have knowledge gaps, they have attitude problems. Some. And indeed in the health service that is also true. And I just raised the question, and you also point out how difficult it is for people to find time to do things on a voluntary basis. Generally it's people who are motivated to train themselves, they recognise they've got a problem, they will seek out that resource. I just raised the question, is there a role for Cafcass to mandate training in parental alienation? Yes.
I mean, it's a good question, and we're certainly going to mandate training on our high conflict pathway, which includes alienation. I think it would, for us, trying to cover emotional harm in its complexity and range for children, it's important to cite alienation within the spectrum of what goes on emotional harm. But yes, that training for high conflict will be mandatory.